Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Such a pleasure to meet you. Although we have been interacting over the weekend through our WhatsApp group, now it's for real. It's such a pleasure to be virtually in touch with you. My name is Davison Belen Lopez. I'm the Deputy Dean for International Affairs at UFMG. And this year, I am in charge of our working group on 2020 Summer School in Brazilian Studies. We have been working hard to bring it to life since August 2019. And we are really, really proud of this batch we have gathered together for this year's edition. As I can tell already, you guys accommodate all the diversity of this world. It's impressive. You put together into our classroom your enthusiastic participation, and there's lots of difference with regard to nationalities. There are 27 different nationalities represented in our summer school in Brazilian studies this year. You represent different backgrounds, academic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, and we are so happy we are together for the coming weeks. We really expect you to have the time of your lives for the coming days. What I can tell you for now is that you have a very exciting and very promising program ahead. Uh, Yesterday, you have had a season opener, which was amazing. I believe I have enjoyed lots. And as far as I can tell, I've been reading your tweets on Twitter. You have also enjoyed a lot our conversation with Miss Patricia Campos Melo. It was a beautiful start. Uh, Today, we are having our history class with Professor Rafael Scopacasa, who is amazing as well. And this is the reason why we always pick him to start. He's always in our lineup, and he's always in the beginning to leave the best impression ever. He's just amazing. So you're going to enjoy a lot this lecture of today. What I want to share with you, besides my welcoming words and besides sharing with you all my happiness and enthusiasm to have you with us, is some first-hand information we have just received yesterday in the afternoon. Some news from London. There are some agencies which rank universities around the world. One of them is called Times Higher Education, and they are based in Britain. And yesterday, they have just released their rankings, regional rankings about Latin America. And UFMG has reached its highest position ever. We are now top 5 in Latin America. We are very happy and proud and wanted to share with you. It's amazing. It's really something. It's an achievement to be a top 5 institution in our region. So now you who belong to our body of students, you also are a part in this history. And this is why we wanted each one of you to know this very important piece of news. Uh, Again, this is all about diversity. You are virtually in a country of diversity. Brazil is a mosaic of nations. I mean, there are many, many different nations inside Brazilian territory. Brazil accounts for half of South America's territory, half of South America's population and economy. So, if you want to understand this part of the world where we are, UFMG is based, understanding Brazil is a good initial step. And I want to congratulate each one of you for being recruited. I know that many of you have undergone very tough recruitment processes inside your own home universities. And this leads to very high expectations We believe we are before a very, very special batch of students, and this will be an awesome experience, I'm pretty sure. Just to conclude my welcoming words, my inaugural address, I just want to leave you with that piece of advice, which I have shared with you inside our WhatsApp group, but I want to stress, I want to state it again. The one thing, the most important thing you're taking away from this experience is the network, the global network you're building up. Classes will be great. I have no doubt you're going to enjoy yourselves a lot. We have a very nice cultural program as well. So you're going to be toured across museums, and you're going to learn about lots of landmarks in Brazil and the like. But the one most important thing is being connected with your peers, with your colleagues around the world. This is priceless, trust me. This is the most important legacy you're taking for life from this experience. So enjoy this experience as much as you can. We are enjoying ourselves a lot. I now invite Professor Rafael Scopacasa to take over and wish you an amazing summer school on Brazilian studies this year. Whatever you need, just let us know. And at the end of the class, Luciana Fiuza, who also is a part of our team, she will be giving you some additional guidelines. But for now, enjoy yourselves. You are going to have an excellent class now. And always bring up your questions. As we have done yesterday, there's the chat mechanism where you can just pour your questions. So don't spare Professor Scopacasa. He will be willing to answer your questions. Thank you very much and see you.
Well, thank you, Davison, for those extremely kind words about me. And I'd also like to I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone. I hope everyone can hear me well enough. And I'd like to start by thanking Davison and all the organizers of the UFMG Summer School. It's an extremely great pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to come and talk to you about Brazilian history. Although I should start by pointing out that I'm not a Brazilian history expert. It's important that you know that. I'm actually a Roman history person, but nonetheless, it's certainly been very exciting for me to come back to Brazilian history, which I studied a rather long time ago at university when I was still an undergraduate. And I'm certainly very keen to discuss some aspects of Brazilian history with all of you here today. So as I understand it, we have until my 10 a.m., which means just under 2 hours. So what I'm planning to do is talk for about an hour and a half, maybe, and then use the last 20 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. I hope that sounds okay to everyone. That's how we did things last year, and I think it worked okay. So that's what I'm planning to do. Right. Well, should we kick off then? History is as much about the past as it is about the present. Oh, I was forgetting to share my screen with you so you can see my slides. Hang on. There you go. Start sharing. Okay, so you should all be seeing the first slide of the presentation that says Brazilian history, a very, I'd like to stress the word very quick overview. So that's what everyone should be seeing. Well, history, as I was saying, is as much about the past as it is about the present. It's about looking at trying to understand the present by looking at the past. And of course, the main issue, the main current issue, which is uppermost in everybody's mind right now, is the global COVID pandemic. And as you know, the death toll here in Brazil has been devastating. As I understand it, we have about, until now, so far, 65,000 people who have died of this disease in Brazil. And many people think that one of the factors that contribute to this scenario is the fact that quite a lot of Brazilians still live in poverty and therefore don't have the means to protect themselves adequately from the risk of contagion. A quick look at Brazil's history, which I'm planning to do with you today, might help us understand why the country has so many people living in poverty nowadays, and also how Brazilian society came to be so unequal. Inequality is one of the hallmarks of Brazilian society, as you know. A lot of this, of course, is to do with Brazil's more recent colonial past. When I say recent, I mean the last 500 years or so. But to really put things in perspective, I propose that we go all the way back to the pre-Columbian era and begin with the first humans, the first groups of peoples to inhabit this area that was eventually to become Brazil. So, next slide. There we go. Right. So before the arrival of the Portuguese in 1500, indigenous societies were spread across the area that was to become Brazil. And they had been here for at least 12,000 years. There is a consensus that the American continent was the last to be peopled by modern humans. And this happened between 25 and 15,000 years ago. The estimates vary slightly. Genetics researchers at this university here at UFMG have been at the forefront of studies into the peopling of the Americas. And recently they published a couple of really groundbreaking articles, scientific articles that shed some exciting new light on the subject. And the lead author of one of these articles, the one in the reference that you're seeing in the slide, Tomás Binocchi, argues that there were three or four founding lineages, so to speak, of Asian settlers in the Americas. And this is based on a sample of Y chromosomes of present-day indigenous individuals, as well as on some ancient DNA analysis. So it's all very cutting edge. And Pinotti and his team have concluded, based on the evidence, that the peopling, that South America, the South American continent, was occupied relatively rapidly. And by that, I mean in the space of 2,000 years, most likely via the Pacific coast. So this, the Pacific coastal route that I'm pointing out here with the cursor. And this initial wave apparently was followed by several other waves of incomers from Asia. Until the ice bridge connecting Asia and the North American continent disappeared around 12,000 years ago. What you're seeing there is a national park. It's called the Serra da Capivara National Park, and it's located in the northeast of Brazil, in the state of Piauí. And it's a very important area for pre-Columbian history because it houses the oldest and possibly the largest concentration of pre-Columbian archaeological sites, not just in Brazil, but in all of the Americas. And the Capivara mountain range, which is shown in that picture, well, part of it anyway, was apparently densely populated in the pre-Columbian era, possibly as early as 12,500 years ago. And we have the amazing rock art of Serra da Capivara, which, as you can see, depicts a wide range of scenes, which are fascinating, but also a little difficult to interpret. Some of them are a bit ambiguous. Here, for example, you have a possible birthing scene, although we can't be entirely sure. This next one, for example, I wonder if anyone could perhaps venture a guess as to what's being depicted. And I think people can maybe use the chat function to maybe write down what they think might be being depicted. And I wonder. There we go. Now let's see if I can see the chat. I'm not sure I can see it.
Can you see? They're saying, Professor, hunting, ceremonial celebration.
Yes.
Maria
Yes.
says a horse.
Yes.
Arena, Dicky, and Maria and Shenyang say it's a hunt. And then Aaron says it's a ceremonial celebration. And and then Francisco says they may be collecting fruit from the trees. And Shisla says, is it a feast? Celebration of animals, Stephanie says.
Those are all very good interpretations. I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions, and thank you, Luciana, for mediating, because for some reason I can't see the chat. I
know, Professor. It's because when you're sharing screen, everything turns out to be a little bit more complicated.
That's fine. That's okay.
That's for the screen sharing makes it difficult.
No, it's perfect. I mean, I think you did a splendid job. Thank you so much. And yes, I'd like to say that everybody made really interesting interpretations, and I would agree that this might probably be a depiction of some sort of hunting scene with possible depictions of megafauna. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with the term megafauna. It refers to those very large mammals that inhabited South America in the pre-Columbian era, and which were hunted, apparently were hunted to extinction, even before the arrival of the Europeans, before the European conquest. I mean, if this is to scale, which it might be, then it could be the depiction of such megafauna, although it might not be to scale. I mean, like I said, these scenes are a bit ambiguous, but yes, feasting, possibly some ritual performances, activities. I think those are all very valid interpretations, and there are also scenes from daily and ritual life, other scenes that seem to depict episodes of daily life and ritual life of the communities, the ancient communities that inhabited this region thousands and thousands of years ago. I mean, this one that you're seeing seems to depict a collective celebration of some sort, although we can't be certain. I mean, here we have another one of those rather ambiguous scenes. I'm not sure what you think it might be, but as I understand it, experts believe it might be some sort of punishment, the depiction of a collective public punishment, possibly a flogging scene. But then, it's really open to interpretation. This one is one of my favorites. It's simply known as the kiss. It's very unique. In terms of the identity, the cultural identity of these ancient South American communities, the Tupi, that is the people who spoke the Tupi language, or should I say the Tupi language family, the Tupi accounted for a very significant proportion of the pre-Columbian inhabitants of South America by the time the Portuguese arrived in Brazil in around 1500. And here you have, you're seeing two much later depictions of Tupi individuals. Though they are two paintings from a Dutch painter called Albert Eckhout from the 17th century. The Tupi are believed to have originated in the Amazon area, this region that you're seeing that's marked out as Mosaic Zone, the purple colored one. And the Tupi apparently began to expand to the south and to the east of the Amazon. And this apparently happened more or less around the time that the Romans were conquering Western Europe. That is to say, around 2,000 years ago. So that should give you a good reference point, a good chronological reference point. And the Tupi eventually seem to have occupied the entire stretch of the Atlantic coast of South America. That was apparently the situation by the time the Europeans arrived. And this Tupi expansion is apparently was one of the largest, if not the largest one in ancient South America. The Tupi speakers spread across an area of almost 4,000 kilometers. They spread 4,000 kilometers across South America from Amazonia all the way to the southeastern portion of what is today Brazil, as you can see, where all the red dots are concentrated. What drove this massive expansion is still a rather debated topic in Brazilian and pre-Columbian archaeology. One possible cause, of course, may have been population growth. But some scholars also believe that the Tupi possessed something like what they call a warlike expansionist ethos or disposition, or culture, shall I say, a warlike expansionist culture. That's what some of the specialists believe. And this warlike expansionist culture may also have played a part in their expansion. Other scholars argue that the expansion was driven by climate change, more specifically the onset of drier climate conditions in South America around 2,000 years ago, which would have reduced the forested area, would have reduced the jungle, the Amazon jungle, and would have caused the Tupi to move out of Amazonia. Of course, there's still a lot of debate about this, and scholars haven't really come to a consensus. Although, interestingly, the Tupi word for the land that they eventually came to occupy as they expanded towards the coast was Pindorama, and that in the Tupi language means something like, as I understand it, means something like the land of the palm trees, or quite simply, there will be palm trees, as in a sentence. At any rate, the Tupi expansion displaced some groups that already occupied the coastal areas of the Atlantic coast of South America. And these previous occupants of the coast who were displaced are known today as the G speakers. Here you can see that's what they're called in contemporary, like current bibliography, the G speakers. And the map shows you their probable, the probable distribution of these groups at around the time of the European conquest. Now, owing to the Tupi expansion, which happened, as I said, around 2,000 years ago, the G speakers, who until then occupied the coast, were driven out of the coast and were forced to move into the central upland areas of Brazil. Basically this area here that you're seeing. Right? Now, the name by which the Tupi referred to these people, these G people that they displaced, was Tapuia. And Tapuia in the Tupi language means, it translates as something like barbarian, foreigner, stranger, and that general kind of idea. And here on the screen, you have, again, a much later depiction from the 17th century of some tapuyas, some so-called tapuyas apparently performing some kind of ritual dance. Now, stereotypical images of these indigenous peoples of South America as, say, Stone Age bands of hunter-gatherers, sort of frozen in time before the Europeans arrived, were once very common in Brazilian history textbooks. But these stereotypical images are now giving way to a much more nuanced, much more dynamic understanding of these pre-Columbian societies, who obviously practiced several kinds of agriculture, and they were also obviously organized enough to be able to build monumental structures, some of which may have functioned as public spaces, presumably. In the Amazon, for example, in Amazonia, evidence of intense agriculture and dense settlement are coming to light. And this exciting new information is really altering how the way we understand the history of the Amazon, which, well, the Amazon, until recently, as you may know, was regarded as this pristine, primordial jungle, whereas more recently, as you can see in the pictures I'm showing you, aerial photography and also geophysical survey, like new techniques in archaeology, are revealing the existence of highly complex communities, highly complex societies in pre-Columbian Amazonia, the existence of highly complex societies who had their own rich and sophisticated cultures. And here you have an example of what is known as the Marajó culture, which is an archaeological culture that has a very distinctive pottery style, as you can see. And this Marajó culture developed in part of Amazonia, sort of around the time of the European Middle Ages, more or less. So when the Portuguese arrived in 1500, the indigenous population of Brazil may have been around 3.5 million, with several hundred culture and language groups present. A linguistic survey from a while back revealed the existence of a total of 188 living indigenous languages in Brazil today, with a total of 155,000 speakers. And as for the so-called uncontacted tribes, in early 2007, the Brazilian government agency that's responsible for the indigenous communities, it's called FUNAI, F-U-N-A-I, reported that it had confirmed the presence of 67 different uncontacted tribes, so-called uncontacted tribes in Brazil, which was up from 40 in the tally of 2005. And that meant that with the increase, Brazil had surpassed New Guinea as the country with the largest number of so-called uncontacted tribes or uncontacted societies in the world. By the time the Portuguese arrived in Brazil in April 1500, Portugal, as you know, had a thriving commercial global empire that spanned, like I said, the entire globe, practically the entire globe, with outposts in Africa, India, as you can see, and even as far afield as Ming China and Japan. And here you have a Japanese 16th century print that shows a Portuguese vessel, a Portuguese ship. In the early 16th century, when the Portuguese arrived in Brazil, therefore, they controlled the spice trade between Europe and the East. And that's really what kept the Portuguese Empire going for a while. But it soon faltered. This global commercial empire that the Portuguese had soon faltered and gave way to other, like Portugal by the 17th century had already been superseded by other European nations, more specifically Spain and later the Netherlands. In the very early days, the Portuguese weren't really sure what they wanted to do with Brazil. It wasn't until the 1530s that the first efforts were made to occupy and settle Portuguese South America more permanently. And this that you're seeing might well be the earliest world map ever to depict, to show the Brazilian landmass, which you can see on the bottom left corner here. The Portuguese initially thought that Brazil was an island, by the way. These initial efforts at colonization involved the creation of the so-called captaincies. And these were the main colonial units, more or less equivalent to the, say, the 13 English colonies in North America, more or less. Not quite the same, but. And it's interesting that at this particular juncture, for us to compare the ways in which European powers appropriated the New World in very different ways. So that we can put the Portuguese approach in its broader context. So the English, for example, relied on natural landmarks, such as rivers, mountains, trees, to demarcate and divide the plots of land. The Spanish relied not on the granting of land specifically, but of labor. These were groups of people, basically enslaved native peoples, who were assigned to individual colonists. And these grants of slave labor were called encomiendas in Spanish. The Portuguese, however, were different. They, as you know, were a deeply seafaring people. So, and they'd been pioneering, for example, the sailing of the Atlantic ever since the 14th century. So in good nautical fashion, they used the sextant, which is this instrument here, bottom right corner. It's a sailing instrument to demarcate, to mark out slices of territory in a more abstract geometrical way. And these slices of territory became the so-called captaincies, which you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. It's also important to stress that initially, well, for the first 200 years or so, Portuguese colonization of Brazil was largely limited to the coast. And this is important for reasons that are going to become clear in a bit. From the very beginning, the Catholic Church was closely involved in the Portuguese colonization of Brazil. And this means that from the outset, the colonial period of Brazil's history is marked by the mass conversion of native individuals into Catholicism. Ever since the first arrival of the Portuguese, the Europeans, in the American continent, the Catholic Church was very interested in converting the masses of indigenous individuals, indigenous peoples. And this was very much a result of changes that were happening in Europe at the time of the famous Counter-Reformation, which you surely know about. In a nutshell, the Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church's reaction to the wave of Protestant reformations that spread throughout Western Europe in the late early 16th century, the first years of the 16th century. So to compensate for the loss of supporters of Catholics in Europe, the Roman Catholic Church decided to invest heavily in sending out missionaries to the recently discovered, or should I say conquered, areas of South America. And their aim was obviously to convert as many natives as possible into Catholicism. And Portugal, of course, was a Catholic nation, along with Spain. So the Portuguese crown cooperated with the interests of the church, though not without some degree of tension, as we will see in a bit. The Catholic missionaries who came to Brazil were mostly from the newly created Company of Jesus. They were known as the Jesuit priests, and they're still around today, although not so much in Brazil anymore, and we will get to the reason for that soon. And this painting that you're seeing depicts the founder of the Order of the Jesuits. He was a Spanish priest called Ignacio de Loyola. The Jesuits set up various missions in colonial Brazil, all over the territory, not just on the coast, but also in areas further inland. These Jesuit missions were usually set up right next to, or sometimes inside, pre-existing indigenous settlements or villages. It was one such Jesuit mission that originated the city of São Paulo, for example, which is the largest city in Brazil, and I think also in Latin America. To put it more accurately, though, São Paulo, like many other Brazilian cities, originated as a merger between the Jesuit mission that was founded in 1554 and the pre-existing indigenous villages nearby. And that's why many of these earliest colonial Brazilian settlements were made up of indigenous groups who converted to Catholicism, converted to Christianity, and apparently soon ceased to self-identify as Tupi, as Jé, or any of the other major ethnicities. The Jesuit priest who founded the mission in São Paulo was José de Anchieta, which is why until recently, São Paulo, he was celebrated as the founder of São Paulo, although, as we've seen, that's not quite the full story. He was, anyway, a remarkable, by all accounts, a remarkable character from the Canary Islands, who spent most of his life in Brazil during the very beginning of the Portuguese colonization. And he wrote ethnographic and linguistic treatises about the native inhabitants, about the Tupi mostly. And these treatises, written by José de Anchieta, remain a valuable source of information on the, for example, on the old Tupi language. However, although Portugal as a Catholic country was originally willing to support the interests of the Catholic Church, it didn't take very long for conflicts to emerge. The arrival of the Portuguese, the arrival of the Jesuits soon clashed with the interests of the Portuguese colonists, who would much rather enslave the indigenous peoples and exploit them as sources of labor, rather than having these indigenous peoples converted into Catholicism and living in Jesuit missions. And this grew eventually into a major conflict of interest, which lasted the entire colonial period of Brazil's history. And the relationship between Jesuits and colonists deteriorated so much that by the 1750s, all the Jesuits were expelled from Portuguese America. We'll get to that in a minute. At any rate, it would be wrong to see the indigenous peoples as a separate group, as a passive entity that was fought over by Europeans, that is, by the Jesuits and the colonists. The situation on the ground was a lot more complicated, and for that reason, a lot more fascinating. There are many indications that from early on, indigenous peoples either intermarried with the Portuguese colonists, who were, by the way, overwhelmingly male, or they moved into colonial settlements, very often the plantations, known in Portuguese as engenhos, where sugar, tobacco, and spirits were produced for export. After only a few generations, these assimilated indigenous people apparently no longer identified as indigenous, or more accurately as Tupi-Jé, or any of the other indigenous ethnicities. The first children of Europeans and Amerindians, indigenous peoples, were at the time, in the colonial period, were called mamelucos. And that's a term which roughly corresponds to the Spanish word mestizo. And these two 17th century paintings that you're seeing here depict two such individuals who at the time were categorized as mamelucos from the northeast of Brazil. And the word mameluco probably derives from the Arabic mamluk, which means basically slave. And it was used commonly in reference to soldiers and rulers who had slave origins, especially in Egypt. So that's where the term comes from. Arguably, this process of intermarriage and integration helped form the demographic basis of of the population of colonial Brazil. Though, as we will see, the African contribution was also key. It's interesting that today, genetics research suggests that all modern Brazilians are, on average, 8% Amerindian, genetically, that is. So this colonial encounter that we're talking about was actually a much more complicated process than it seems at first sight. We're not necessarily talking about indigenous peoples being westernized or acculturated in an absolute sense. In São Paulo, for example, and also Rio de Janeiro, you get a very interesting phenomenon. You get tribal chiefs, indigenous tribal chiefs, who in the 16th century convert to Christianity and then go on to change their names and found some of the so-called leading settler or colonial aristocratic families. The founder of the powerful Sousa clan, or Sousa in Brazilian Portuguese, from the city of Niterói, which is right next to Rio, was a man originally called Arariboia. You can see it in the key here, Arariboia. And he was chief of the Temiminó tribe, an indigenous tribe, who helped the Portuguese to drive out some French raiders from Rio in the 16th century, in the late 16th century. And in return for his services to the Portuguese crown, Arariboia, the chief Arariboia, was given the name Martim Afonso de Souza, the Portuguese name Martim Afonso de Souza. And he was also given a very large estate. So, as you can see, in many significant ways, this individual Amerindian became himself a colonial settler and also landowner. And there were probably many more like him. Although, as we will see, the whole issue of landowning in Brazil is rather complicated because technically only the Portuguese crown was allowed to own land. Everybody else was at best a tenant. So as a result of this peculiar situation, as late as the first half of the 19th century, the main language that was spoken in places like São Paulo and also Rio was in fact not Portuguese at all, but Nheengatu, which is a Tupi word for something like general language or pidgin. So this was a kind of lingua franca which consisted of elements from the Tupi language, from several different indigenous Amerindian languages, and which was spoken widely in colonial Brazil, not just in São Paulo and Rio, but throughout Brazil. That is, until Nheengatu was outlawed in the 18th century. And Nheengatu eventually died out in the course of the 19th century, which is when very strong efforts were being made to Europeanize or Westernize Brazil. But we will talk about that in a minute. This slide that I'm showing you contains some examples of Nheengatu words, many of which are still present in Brazilian Portuguese. So, for example, some of the more famous ones, easily identifiable, are mingau, which is something like porridge. I'm not exactly sure whether it's supposed to be made out of any specific kinds of ingredients, but you have mingau. Maracujá is our Brazilian Portuguese word for passion fruit, although obviously it is not a Portuguese word. It's got indigenous roots, and the same goes for cuia. Like a cuia is something like a bowl or a gourd, as you can see. This animal, the capivara, you may already have heard about it. It's the largest member of the rodent family, and it's very common in Brazil. There are quite a few of them that inhabit the outskirts of the surrounding areas of the UFMG campus. So yeah, so there you have some examples of words that are originally from indigenous languages and that are still that were part of the Nhangatu vocabulary, which was once the major language that was spoken in Brazil, and some of those words survived into the present day, are still used today. They're very common. It was not uncommon. Sorry, I need to plug my computer in at the wall. Just a minute. It was not uncommon. Sorry about that. For indigenous communities to side with the Portuguese against other indigenous peoples. Raids and wars were led by men called the bandeirantes, or standard bearers, flag bearers in English. The bandeirantes made inroads into the unknown expanses of the hinterland in the 17th and 18th centuries, and they were in search mainly of booty and slaves, spoils, war spoils and slaves. The interesting thing is that indigenous people often made up the cohorts of these bandeirantes, and they fought, which means that they fought alongside Europeans, alongside the Portuguese, against other Amerindian communities. In fact, some of the leading bandeirantes of the 17th and 18th centuries were themselves of indigenous extraction, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to you after everything that we've just seen. And this was, of course, owing to this intense intermarriage between Amerindians and Portuguese, as we have just discussed. One of these bandeirantes was a man called Domingos Jorge Velho, and he's known for having destroyed a very important settlement of runaway African slaves, or quilombo. And this happened in the late 17th century. We're going to talk about this in a minute. All this, of course, does not deny that indigenous peoples were massacred and exterminated throughout the colonial period. In many ways, the interaction between Europeans and indigenous groups was violent and disastrous. And I certainly don't want to paint too rosy a picture of this colonial encounter. It's enough to glance at some then and now maps showing the spread and the number of indigenous cultures and languages, for example, for us to get an idea of just how negative the colonial encounter turned out to be for the indigenous inhabitants of South America, of Brazil. Colonization often meant the loss and the disappearance of rich indigenous cultures, as well as a dramatic reduction of the indigenous population. Nevertheless, that said, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that identity and culture are very complex phenomena. In many cases, as we saw, what happened was not exactly the complete annihilation of all indigenous peoples, but rather a change in the way that these people viewed themselves and identified themselves. Their contact, the contact between the Amerindians and Europeans and their culture, European culture, was sometimes peaceful. Sometimes it wasn't peaceful. Sometimes it was peaceful. And it didn't always lead to the complete destruction of indigenous culture. A lot of it survived, as I believe I've been able to demonstrate. It's important to remember also that by 1680, the enslavement of indigenous people had officially been outlawed in colonial Brazil. The Portuguese saw Brazil in the colonial period as basically a kind of cash cow. The aim was to exploit the colony as much as possible and with as little effort as possible. So this was a rather predatory kind of colonization that was centered primarily on exploitation and not on the settlement and the construction of a new society, as was arguably the case in the English colonies of North America, for example. So for this reason, one could summarize the entire colonial period as a series of exploitation-driven economic booms. First came the sugarcane boom, and then the tobacco boom, and then the gold rush happened in Minas Gerais, which is where UFMG is based, as you know. In the 1700s, the gold rush took place in Minas Gerais. We'll talk about that soon. And that was followed by the coffee boom and the rubber boom. In both of these both the coffee and the rubber booms began in the late 19th century, and they carried into the period of Brazilian independence, as we will discuss. Of course, there is a lot more to Brazilian history than just that. But it seems important to stress that during the colonial era, in many ways foreshadows the way in which modern Brazil functions. In a way, the Portuguese colonization was frequently happened as a reaction to economic opportunities and also to foreign threats, namely threats arising from other European nations. In fact, the Dutch, as you may know, managed to occupy a portion of northeastern Brazil, where most of the sugar plantations were located, in the mid-17th century, although that was temporary. The topic of economic exploitation brings us to what is perhaps the biggest, but also the most difficult issue in Brazil's history. And I'm talking here, of course, about slavery. Throughout the colonial period, different forms of free and unfree labor coexisted in Brazil. There were free peasants, there were free craftspeople, and there were also free merchants. However, the bulk of the workforce in Brazil, in colonial Brazil, consisted, of course, of enslaved individuals. And the main challenge for historians who tackle this issue is to try and understand the nature of colonial Brazilian slavery and also how it compares to other instances of slavery in history. So on that note, we can start with a few comparisons. One of the big differences scholars recognize between slavery in Brazil and in the US, in the colonial period, of course, was that in the US, slavery was what they call sectional. That is, there was, for example, the division between slave and free states. Whereas in Brazil, the use of slave labor was a lot more widespread. In fact, many scholars estimate that Brazil received more Africans through the Atlantic slave trade than any other nation in the world. The Portuguese seem to have imported almost 10 times as many slaves into Brazil than the British did into North America. Around 4 million enslaved individuals, enslaved Africans, were forcibly brought to Brazil between the 16th and 19th centuries, whereas during the same period, we have an estimate of 465,000 that were forcibly taken to the English colonies of North America. So to put these figures in perspective, an estimated 10 to 12 million Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas between 1500 and 1880. Of these 10 to 12 million, 48%, as you can see on the map, around 48% went to the Caribbean, and 41% went to Brazil. And this gives you a general idea of how disproportionate the number of Africans, enslaved Africans that were brought to Brazil is in comparison with the English colonies in North America, which seem to have received only 5% of the total number of African individuals, enslaved African individuals. Obviously, this historical process created some very strong ties between Brazil and Africa. And these ties are still very prominent today. The northeastern Brazilian state of Bahia, for example, which is just north of Minas Gerais, where UFMG is based. Bahia includes the largest number of African-descended individuals outside of the African continent. Most of the Africans who were brought to Brazil came from Angola in southern Western Africa. There we go. Angola, and also from the Congo region, a bit further north. And the reasons that led the Portuguese to employ Africans as enslaved laborers is, the reasons are multifaceted and complex. We won't have time to deal with them in detail today, but it's important to point out that, of course, slaves were regarded as an important economic resource. But like I said, we won't have time to delve into this particularly complicated question just at the moment. Instead, we can talk a little bit about the horrible conditions aboard the slave ships. These conditions, of course, were absolutely horrific throughout the entire period of the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic crossing was absolutely cruel. An estimated 15% of the people died during the journey, during the crossing. And what you're seeing there, you may have seen this before, it's a British abolitionist pamphlet from the late 18th century, which shows just how horrific the conditions aboard these slave ships actually were. But then pamphlets such as this one arguably played a very important role in the British decision to abolish the Atlantic slave trade in 1807. The enslaved Africans who survived the crossing were bought and sold as property. Actually, historians consider this a specific kind of slavery. It's called chattel slavery, meaning that the slaves in that category, chattel slaves, are bought and sold as movable property. Clearly, whatever term we choose to use to describe this, we're dealing with people who were systematically dehumanized. When the enslaved Africans arrived in Brazil, they were branded, usually on the cheek, and they were sent to markets where they were sold. So treated pretty much like cattle. Enslaved individuals performed many different kinds of work in Brazil. Sometimes they were housekeepers, as shown on this early 19th century engraving. Sometimes they dealt with specialized craft production, but the vast majority of them were put to work as agricultural laborers in the large plantations on the coast of Brazil, which, as I pointed out, mainly grew tobacco and sugarcane. Here you have a 17th century engraving of a sugar mill, or engenho, in Pernambuco, which is in the northeast, again, in the northeast region of Brazil. And you can just about make out the enslaved individuals performing various different kinds of tasks. The enslaved individuals planted and harvested sugarcane, and they processed it into sugar, which was a major Brazilian export during the colonial period. And this was an extremely hard type of work that went on for 10 out of 12 months of the year. All aspects of this work were very tough, but perhaps the most extenuating bit were the harvest and the processing of the sugar cane, which had to be done in a hurry because, as you may know, or may not know, sugarcane juice goes sour very quickly in just one day. So slaves would work 48 hours straight harvesting and grinding the sugarcane in order to process it into sugar. And the grinding of the sugarcane was often done with 2 or 3 big rollers, such as the one that you see on the engraving there. And this was perhaps the most dangerous bit of the job because sometimes the slaves' hands would get caught in the rollers. So people would get mutilated on top of everything else. As you can see, the working conditions in these sugar plantations in the 17th and 18th centuries were so harsh that by the late 18th century, the average life expectancy of an enslaved African male individual seems to have been only 23 years. And this seems to compare very poorly with the data that we have for enslaved individuals in North America and even the Caribbean. So it would seem that Portuguese-run slavery was particularly brutal. And this seems to have been so much the case that the slave population in Brazil apparently was never able to grow on its own, which is why new slaves had to be constantly brought in from Africa. Up until 1888, when slavery was finally abolished. But we'll get to that in a minute. I mean, if we have the time. I think we're running short on time here. I'll see if I can speed things up a bit. At the turn of the 18th century, from the 17th to the 18th century, gold and diamonds were discovered here in the state of Minas Gerais, which, as I said, is the Brazilian state that houses UFMG, where I am speaking to you from. As you may know, Minas, right? Minas is the Portuguese word for mines. So Minas is pretty much a landlocked mountainous region. And it had hitherto, until the late 17th century, it had been spared. It had been sparsely populated because, as we saw, most of the action was happening on the coast. But the discovery of gold and diamonds in the first decades of the 18th century brought an enormous number of people over to Minas, attracted a huge number of people into Minas Gerais. And they were all obviously in search of gold and diamonds. So the sleepy little villages that were few and far between soon grew into major economic and cultural hubs in the first half of the 18th century. The main example, of course, is the city of Ouro Preto, formerly known as Vila Rica or Richville. But also we have Mariana, which is just an hour and a half drive from Belo Horizonte, which is where UFMG is based, like the main UFMG campus. And there's also Sabará, which is even closer to Belo Horizonte, even closer to UFMG. And it's one of these earliest gold rush towns in Minas Gerais. There's also Tiradentes, which is very picturesque and touristy. Also São João del Rei. Both São João del Rei and Tiradentes are a bit further south, closer to the state of São Paulo and also closer to Rio. Of course, the bulk of the gold that was wrested out of the Minas Mountains ended up naturally in Portugal. And here you have some examples of 18th century Portuguese churches that have quite a bit of golden architecture in them, and also a gold doubloon from the early 18th century, Portuguese doubloon. Perhaps surprisingly, though, some of the Minas gold actually managed to stay here in Minas. And it can be seen in the amazing decoration of the Baroque churches in places such as Ouro Preto, Mariana, the ones that I just showed you. They were all built in the 1700s. Although in Rio, the Church of São Francisco da Penitência, this one on the bottom right corner, also had its fair share of Minas gold, as you can see. As in other parts of colonial Brazil, enslaved individuals formed the bulk of the workforce, of the mining workforce in the 18th and 19th century in Minas Gerais. As in the coastal plantations, the working conditions were absolutely horrific. This photograph of an 18th century gold mine in Ouro Preto reminds us of just how claustrophobic and dangerous gold mining can be, especially in pre-industrial contexts. Right? While this image shows an enslaved African male individual being flogged, reminds us of the dehumanization that these people were subjected to. However, because of the peculiar dynamics of gold and diamond mining, the enslaved individuals who came to Minas Gerais found themselves in a new kind of situation, which differed from the one on the coastal plantations in some very important respects. The gold rush society of colonial Minas Gerais was a lot more dynamic. We need to remember that gold and diamond are movable wealth, and therefore social climbers were more frequent. The enslaved individuals who worked as miners, as gold and diamond miners, were allowed to buy their own freedom if they were lucky enough to find enough gold to satisfy their masters and also have some left over for them to use to purchase their own freedom, which, as you know, is a process called manumission. It seems to have been very common, by the way, manumission seems to have been very common in 18th and early 19th century Minas Gerais, certainly more so than in the sugar and tobacco farms on the coast. And interestingly, one thing that enslaved that freed enslaved individuals often did as soon as they purchased their freedom was to go and purchase their own slaves. It's difficult to determine how common this practice was, but we do hear of several former slaves, either African-born or African-descended former slaves, who once purchasing their freedom, having purchased their freedom, go on to purchase their own retinues of enslaved individuals. And one interesting example concerns a freed woman called Bárbara Gomes de Abreu e Lima. That is not her, by the way. That's a depiction of a freed woman in 18th century Minas, but Barbara may well have looked like that, which is why I'm showing you the image. Barbara lived in the town of Sabará, which I just showed you, in the mid 1700s. As you'll recall, Sabará is the next town over from Belo Horizonte, which is where UFMG is based. Now, not only did Barbara reside in prime real estate, a house facing the main church of the town, but she also seems to have been the owner of 7 slaves as well as gold and silver jewelry. And I'm proud to say that a professor here at the history department at UFMG, a colleague of mine, Eduardo França Paiva, wrote a super interesting book about Barbara. And he concluded that Barbara was very likely, may have been a role model for other enslaved women at the time. Now, whatever we make of Barbara's story, Barbara's experience, it serves as an important reminder of just how complicated Brazilian slavery and society actually were in the colonial era. Right? Of course, the issue of slave resistance has been attracting growing attention among historians in Brazil and abroad. There were runaway slaves who gathered together in hideouts that were far away from the coast, and some of these hideouts developed into settlements, which were known as quilombos. I mentioned them earlier, you'll recall. The most famous quilombo was located in Palmares, in the northeast of Brazil. It developed during the 17th century, and it had its own social organization and administrative hierarchy. It had its own king, apparently, a man named Zumbi. And it came to an end. The Quilombo dos Palmares came to an end in 1685 when it was destroyed by Domingos Jorge Velho, that bandeirante, that flag bearer that I mentioned earlier. Right? Nowadays, many African Brazilian communities claim to derive from colonial era quilombos. And there is an official status that is recognized by the Brazilian government. It's called the Quilombo status, the Quilombo remnant status, which is given to communities that claim to have originated as Quilombos and that are considered to qualify as such. One of the most noteworthy slave revolts in Brazilian history is the revolt of the Islamic slaves of Bahia, the Malay. These were literate Nigerians who were taken to Bahia, and many of them took with them their own copies of the Quran. And their revolt, which happened in 1835, aimed at no less than creating an Islamic state in 19th century Brazil. The revolt was crushed, but it still stands to this day as a symbol of resistance, and that is used by various different political groups nowadays. Because of its peculiar historical background, Brazil's path to independence was somewhat different than that of the US of other Latin American countries. We've seen how during the colonial period, different areas of Brazil were pretty much doing their own thing. Sugar and tobacco in the Northeast, gold and diamond in Minas, and so on and so forth. They were inward looking, the regions were inward looking and focused on producing and exporting their own commodities. Which means that interdependence between the different regions that made up colonial Brazil seems to have been generally rather low. In fact, this strong regionalism, this trend towards regionalization, is still pretty much a facet of Brazilian society today. Some of this can be explained in terms of geography. Now, for one thing, the absence of major navigable rivers that connect large swathes of the hinterland to the coast may have played a part in this trend towards regional isolation already in the colonial period. Although, as you can see, there are important exceptions, such as the São Francisco River, which runs all the way from Minas Gerais. This is Minas Gerais over here, the state. UFMG is sort of around here, right? And then the São Francisco River runs all the way to the north, and it flows into the Atlantic Ocean further north. So this reminds us that we can't always explain social developments in view of environmental factors. But it certainly interested the Portuguese to have fragmentation rather than unity in colonial Brazil. Disunited subjects are more difficult, are less likely. Disunited subjects are less likely to revolt en masse, and this was already clear to the Romans thousands of years ago. But in addition to geography, another factor, and regionalism, another factor that arguably delayed the process of political independence in Brazil was the strong grip of the Portuguese state. I'm going to have to speed things up a little bit because I think we're running short on time. We noted earlier that the Portuguese approach to colonization differed from that of other European nations. It seems to have been rather predatory and driven towards economic exploitation. And this explains the fact that the overwhelming number of majority of Portuguese people who colonists that came to Brazil were male, right? Their goal was not exactly to start a new life in a new land, but rather to get rich as quickly as possible and return to Europe. Of course, we know that many Portuguese colonists did settle in Brazil and did set up families, often marrying indigenous or African women. But the prevailing mindset was arguably one of quick personal gain rather than building a new home or even a new nation. Portugal certainly made it very difficult for the colonists to think for themselves. Universities, colleges were prohibited from being formed in colonial Brazil, except for the Jesuit colleges, which, as we saw, were mainly focused on converting the natives into Catholicism. So in a way, it would be fair to say that colonial Brazil, never had its own Harvard College, for example, which arguably had important historical consequences. Neither were industries allowed to develop. In 1785, just as the Industrial Revolution was taking off in Britain, the Portuguese Queen, Maria I, issued a decree that prohibited the setting up of manufactories in Brazil. But even this sophisticated system of control and oppression wasn't enough to keep colonists from wanting to take control of their own lives. These attempts did happen, but they were severely undermined because of the way in which colonial society was set up, which I think is becoming clear to you. But I'm speaking here of the so-called Minas Conspiracy, or in Portuguese, Inconfidência Mineira, of 1789. So this was an independence rebellion, an independence movement that was influenced both by the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And here you have the rebels' Latin motto, which is taken from a poem by Virgil, "Liberty though tardy." That would be a rough translation. This template was later taken and used to create the Minas Gerais state flag. The conspirators planned to rise up in rebellion against Portuguese exploitation and the institution of a tax that the Portuguese crown was planning on implementing on the extraction of gold. So really heavy taxes. People weren't happy. They decided to rebel, but the rebellion was crushed. It didn't take hold for various reasons, including the fact that the rebels were mainly men from Minas. So there wasn't much of a network that connected these rebels with other like-minded groups in other parts of colonial Brazil. So all in all, the effort, it did take place, but it was weakened by its limited geographical scope, right? So the The ringleaders were all convicted. The main ringleader was executed publicly. His name was Joaquim José da Silva Xavier. He can be seen in the center of this 19th century painting. He became a sort of national hero afterwards, and he's popularly known as Tiradentes, or tooth puller, tooth remover, tooth puller. Actual political independence from Portugal was not very long in coming, however. The lead up to independence was directly connected to political changes that were happening in Europe in the early 19th century, mainly the rise of Napoleonic France. Napoleon's invasion of Portugal in 1807 prompted the Portuguese royal family to, depending on your point of view, either relocate or escape, flee to Brazil in 1808. So they were escorted by the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, in 1808, and they all arrived in Rio in 1808. And once they arrived in Rio, the Portuguese king, John VI, set up court in Rio. And it's important to remember that Rio had been the colonial capital, the administrative capital, since 1763. So this was a key moment when deeper changes began to take place. And these changes would irrevocably alter the historical trajectory of Brazil. In the end, it would spell the end of Portuguese domination. First of all, Brazil was upgraded to the status of United Kingdom. It ceased to be a colony officially and became part of Portugal. The United Kingdom of Portugal and Brazil was inaugurated in 1808. And in that same year, for the very first time in history, Brazilian ports were open to merchants other than Portuguese merchants. Until then, the Brazilians were only allowed to trade with Portuguese merchants and no other. And that changed in 1808 when John VI allowed Brazilians to trade with other nationals, chiefly, of course, the British, who were interested in tapping into the Brazilian market at the time. So these changes set about a chain reaction that can ultimately seem to result in the political independence from Portugal, which became effective in 1822. After Napoleon's defeat, John VI, the King of Portugal, went back to Lisbon, but he left his son, Pedro, in Brazil, in charge of things. And Pedro, John VI's son, eventually sided with the pro-independence groups in Brazil. And Pedro is credited with the famous Ipiranga shout, which is supposed to have been this dramatic moment when Pedro shouted independence or death. And here you have a 19th century painting that depicts this movement, this moment, rather idealistically, shall we say. Shortly after Brazil's independence was acknowledged by the leading powers of the time, chiefly the UK, the recently emancipated nation adopted as its new political regime a constitutional monarchy. So Brazil, as soon as Brazil became independent, it became a constitutional monarchy, and that is indicated in the first ever Brazilian flag, which is the one that you're seeing. The first Brazilian constitution was drafted in 1824 with the consent of Pedro, John VI's son, who now became Pedro I, or Peter I of Brazil, King Emperor of Brazil. And it's interesting to point out that the 1824 Constitution was the first of several constitutions that have appeared in Brazilian, the recent history of Brazil. Brazil has had no less than 7 different constitutions throughout its history as an independent nation. After the 1824 constitution, there followed another one in 1891, and then again 1934, 1937, 1946, 1967, and finally 1988, which is the one that's currently in place. And one of the most interesting things about the 1824 Constitution is that it was relatively, I stress the word relatively inclusive. It determined that any free or freed person born on Brazilian soil was entitled to citizenship, regardless of race, which is something that contrasts sharply with the sort of race-based exclusion that we see in U.S. history. On the other hand, the 1824 Constitution did exclude several people. That's why I said it was relatively inclusive. It excluded, obviously, enslaved individuals and also indigenous peoples. The enslaved individuals were denied citizenship because, to quote the Constitution, they were not integrated into society. And as for the indigenous peoples, the Constitution excluded them because they were considered uncivilized. Miscegenation, an important concept in Brazilian history, miscegenation was adopted as a key strategy for creating a new national identity at this juncture in Brazilian history. So this is the moment when the famous idea of the mixture of the races, the mixture of the three races, to quote, the expression, that's when this idea comes about in Brazilian history, the early 19th century, with the 1824 Constitution. And this idea has been a very powerful image in the political and social history of the country. It's been presented in various guises, most notably by the 20th century Brazilian sociologist Darcy Ribeiro, which is the one on the right-hand side. Basically, the idea is that the Brazilian people are a mixture of a combination of 3 different groups in more or less equal parts. Europeans, i.e. Portuguese mostly, Amerindians, and Africans or African descended people. As we just saw in our discussion of the colonial period, there is some historical basis for this view, and lately, as I pointed out, genetics research has added significantly to our knowledge of the formation of Brazilian demographics. But it's also true that the idea of the 3-race mixture has been used to suit various political agendas, different political agendas. And we really have to be critical. It's really important to be critical of how the admixture or the miscegenation thesis is employed, both in academia and in society at large. But in the context of early independent Brazil, the idea of the 3-race mixture seems to have been tied to efforts to construct a new national identity, as I said just now. The 1824 Constitution, which was written by this man called José Bonifácio, was exclusionary from a socioeconomic perspective mainly. Only the wealthy were allowed to vote and to hold public office. So this was very much an oligarchic system of government where power lay firmly in the hands of a small elite, a small gentry. And this oligarchic aspect of Brazilian government remained, in my view at least, the norm well into the 20th century, and some would argue to this day. I think we are getting to the point where, if I carry on as I've done until now, we may have no time left for questions. And I think it's really important for there to be some more interaction between participants, because I'm really keen to hear from you and to receive your questions and try to discuss them as best as I can. So what I would suggest, and this is obviously short of ideal, because I still had quite a bit of information to convey about the succeeding periods of Brazil's history. This is short of ideal, but I think, considering the time limit, considering that, as I understand it, we have only until 10 to do this, right? Am I right, Luciana?
Yes, Professor.
Yeah. So
because they have Portuguese classes afterwards, and
right.
There are lots of questions here that I would think would be interesting for you to work on a little bit more, and so that would be ideal if I could share with you some of the audience's thoughts, interesting ones. And I'm going to gather like 4 of them that I found particularly interesting. And then I'm going to gather them, and then maybe you can consider some points on these. So we have Ana Pontes, and she says, Anna, I would assume, is from where? Jessica, to get that information. Let's just gathering that. And she would like to know a little bit more about advances in research on archaeological sites in Brazil, as well as the preservation of these sites, both as heritage and as a document to be studied. Minas Gerais and Piauí are known for their archaeological sites, and how are the studies in other states of Brazil, in northern east states, for instance? And we were just mentioning how interesting it is, the emphasis you, Professor, give on pre-Columbian history, which is something that's not very, more recent things. And then also, people say how interesting the Preto in Minas Gerais and Mariana is, and then Denise.
I'm really sorry, Luciana. I'm very sorry. But apparently there was some kind of issue, and I got temporarily disconnected.
Okay, but did you get on? We were talking about archaeological sites. And
if you could repeat.
Sure.
Thank you. That would be really great.
Then she was saying about talking about a little bit more on advances in research on archaeological sites in Brazil, preservation of these sites, and she mentions that Minas Gerais and Piauí are known for their archaeological sites, and how are these studies in other states of Brazil, in the northeastern states, for example. And then we have a question Denise asked, especially concerning how the behavior how can we understand in a historical perspective a behavior like Barbara's, which is an oppressed person that starts to reproduce the same oppressed structures as it happened to the Indians, Hamlin mentioned indigenous people, sorry. And then this question, everyone wants to know why the Minas flag changed from green to red. This was something everybody is very, and then Jessica asks about enslaved revolts that had independence ideas as well. And Gustavo suggests the reading of Triste Fim de Quaresma to understand the Tupi language. And there's also the movie, right? And everybody's saying how nice this lecture is and how fantastic it is, and how even us Brazilians are learning so much about our own history from this.
Yeah.
And then one last one. Russian scientific tradition, there are two theories of colonization: the white or the good, which states that South Africa would not have developed without European invasion, and the black one, which in which the main idea is that colonizers only brought diseases, slavery, and destruction in the continent to the continent. And so this is from Arina. She's from Russia, from the Friendship in Russia, and then she's been wondering whether there are theories like that in Brazil, and what is your perception of that? That's quite a lot, but let's try to
just so I check that we're all on the same page. The first question was about the archaeological finds and how they are preserved and how they're distributed geographically. Right. So I think I might perhaps take these questions in sequence, and we can perhaps start with the first question, which is the one that I just checked, which is about archaeological finds. Well, I would say, I'm not exactly sure who asked the question. I don't think I heard when you said it. I think it was when I was temporarily disconnected.
Anna from Cardiff University.
Okay, Anna from Cardiff. Okay, well, Anna from Cardiff, thank you for your question. Well, that is a very interesting topic, and one which I would very much like to become more familiar with, because you see, I'm more of a Roman history person, and so I'm really interested in archaeology and what material culture can tell us about ancient societies, about past societies, and also how we can combine material culture sources and written sources to gain a better understanding of the past. I think it's fascinating, and I firmly believe that historians cannot remain entirely dependent on written sources alone. Obviously, they're very important, but in order to access certain aspects, certain levels of the past and past realities, we absolutely need to take into account material culture remains. And as you know, recently there have been some really major breakthroughs in archaeology, both Brazilian archaeology, which is what your question is about, but also archaeology in general. New methods of generating data are appearing, and a lot of it is to do with not just material culture, but also human remains, and also what are called natural records, such as coral rings, tree rings, ice sheets, because those kinds of things can tell us quite a lot about, for example, past climate conditions, past environmental conditions, and as might have become clear to you in my talk, archaeologists, including Brazilian archaeologists, are becoming more and more aware of just how important the environment is for our understanding of history and of past social developments. I mean, of course, we have to be careful not to fall into that old, simplistic view that people's behavior is a result of climatic and environmental forces. That's entirely not what I'm suggesting, and it's not what the people who study the Tupi expansion are suggesting. What they're suggesting is that we also need to take into account environmental factors, because they also play a part, right? They also play a part. They're sort of in interaction with other factors, social and cultural factors. So I think, my first answer to your question is there has been an enormous expansion in our very definition of what constitutes an archaeological source. Do you see what I mean? Until recently, we thought of in terms of material culture, and even in terms of material culture, new techniques and new methods of analysis are being developed, which are to do with chemical analysis of the composition of pottery, like different types of pottery fabric. We can analyze the chemical composition and figure out where the clay came from, because of signature elements that are present in the clay, and so that involves microscopic chemical analysis, and also there are all sorts of different electronic methods that are also being employed to further understand economics and economic behavior and production and consumption in past societies. And I would say that Brazilian archaeology is pretty much keeping in tune. It's staying in tune with all these developments. And I have colleagues in São Paulo in terms of major centers of research. I mean, where the material is kept and stored and analyzed. Coming back to your question, we have major research institutes that deal with Brazilian pre-Columbian archaeology. In the University of São Paulo, there's a museum there that's called the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography, or in Portuguese, Museu de Arqueologia e Etnologia, MAE. You might want to look it up if you're interested in learning more. I can send you information afterwards. We have a really big group here in UFMG as well, who are doing the archaeology of pre-colonial Minas Gerais, and there's a lot of exciting new data that's coming to light, and that's supporting new and innovative novel understandings of pre-Columbian society and history. So UFMG, I would say that the research community at UFMG is strongly focused on Minas, the Minas archaeological heritage, and also further north. We have obviously the Serra da Capivara, and Serra da Capivara is close to various other important archaeological sites that are to do with pre-Columbian Brazil, and there are some leading archaeologists who have kept up research and study into that general field. So Piauí, and these people, there's a really big group in Pernambuco, the University of Pernambuco, Recife. Recife is the capital of Pernambuco, so you might want to look them up as well. I suppose what I can do here is maybe just give you a general idea, which is what I'm trying to do, and also direct you to places and institutions where you can perhaps learn more, gain more information as to the current state of research regarding Brazilian archaeology, how this material is being used, what it's being used for. I mean, we also have to remember that there are very important international collaborations going on between Brazilian universities and British universities, I'm happy to say. I mean, I'm an University of Exeter graduate. I mean, I got my PhD in Exeter, which is not that far away from Cardiff. And in Exeter, there's a person called José Iriarte. He's actually South American, but he teaches at Exeter. And he's involved in this really interesting project with the Federal University of Acre, which is one of the Brazilian states in Amazonia. And they're the ones who are really sort of leading the new discoveries as to the previous, like the pre-Columbian communities that were settled in Amazonia, and also all the stuff I said about it being now clear to us that Amazonia was densely populated and very developed in terms of social and political factors. Much of this is stemming from these international collaborations. So these are the people who are going out and taking these aerial photographies and finding these huge monumental structures, or traces of these monumental structures that are smack in the middle of the jungle. or should I say, where currently we have a jungle. So the idea that the Amazon is a pristine primordial jungle is totally, we know that that's not the case. We now know that it was densely populated before the Portuguese arrived and caused the region to become depopulated. But that's a different story. So I think we have some other questions. I hope that this will at least give you an idea of where you can find more information. I'm sorry that I left this so, to the very end. I should have started this before. About Barbara Gomes da Silva, who is an extraordinary...
Professor, just one thing I want to apologize. I'm sorry, but Anna is from Lisbon. We have Licinia from Cardiff, and then it was my mistake. Because okay. I'm at the same time I'm reading the chat, I have to figure out, so I'm sorry, but
it's fine.
It's fine. It happens. I'm sorry, Anna. And yes, and then this goes together with the you were started talking about Barbara and the oppressed people, and there's another question also that goes together with this, how violent or how peaceful was the invasion of the colonization of Portugal in Brazil.
It was very violent. I think there were some very violent episodes, and also different kinds of violence. It depends on what you consider violence. Extermination, mass extermination, in the sense of massacres and enslavement. That to me counts as violence. So I suppose all of that was very much a part of Portuguese colonization and also European colonization in general. So yes, there was that kind of violence, but also other kinds of violence. Sometimes acculturation can be a form of violence, and also there may have been also what some scholars consider unintentional damage. So for example, germs that the Europeans brought over to the New World, and for which the local indigenous peoples did not have immunity against. So that's actually a very big theory that seeks to explain how it was possible for a handful of Spaniards to destroy the Aztec and the Inca empires. But coming back to, we're really sort of racing against the clock here, so I apologize for having to rush through things. But about Barbara, yes, she's a fantastic, she's a really extraordinary person. And I would recommend that you have a look at Eduardo França Paiva's book, because that's, he actually did research on Barbara, whereas I just read his book. But the idea, it's a rather interesting phenomenon, and at least as I understand it, there are many different ways that you can interpret it. And the way that Eduardo França Paiva interprets it is more or less by saying that there was this slave-owning mentality, this slave-owning culture that transcended social position and transcended ethnic background, so to speak. So it's more or less the idea that everybody in that society, no matter what social position they occupied, everybody in that society was sort of subjected to the same kind of slave-owning mindset, i.e. the idea that owning slaves was good, and that owning slaves was a way of signaling one's prestige and one's status. That would have been a kind of universal cultural code that influenced people's behavior, regardless of their social position. So it's an interesting theory, and I think it goes some way towards explaining certain phenomena, for example, Barbara. But as I said, there are different ways that you can interpret, that you can look at it. You can ask, last year when I mentioned Barbara, one very interesting question was, that I got from the audience was, well, do we know whether Barbara treated, because being a former slave herself, do we know whether she treated her own slaves in a nicer way, in a more humane way, because she had been a slave herself? And that's such a good question, but unfortunately we don't really have the means to answer it properly, because we don't know exactly how she treated her slaves. We know that she sold them, and that she sold slaves that were related to each other, like brother and sister, mother and father. We know that she sold them to different people. I mean, you can look at it in different ways. I mean, how do you interpret that? You know, is that being humane or is that not being humane? It's really tricky. But I hope I've given you a general idea of what the situation is. About the change of the Minas flag, I have to admit I'm at a loss. I think the thing is I'm not myself from Minas Gerais. I'm from São Paulo. So maybe the people, the Minas people can maybe give us some ideas as to why that happened. I mean, I don't know.
Research. We'll all research about that, Professor. Now we're we're so motivated to do that, right? Okay, yeah. And then of course we have lots of questions and we have little time. And I would like to thank the students for the questions. It was such a great lecture, Professor, and a great time for us to start thinking about Brazil in a broader sense. And I am sure many of the questions that remained unanswered today, because it was the first day, everybody was so excited, we will have opportunities to learn a little bit more about Brazilian culture. There's a question about law and the Constitution that you will have the opportunity to deal with specifically with Brazilian law and then Brazilian culture, and there's race in Brazil that will also give us opportunities to, you know, revive this discussion that we didn't have time for today.
Could I just say something? Again, I want to thank you. I want to thank Davis and I want to thank Luciana. I want to thank everybody who organized this. I think it's great. It's a great initiative and I'm really happy to be here. It's always a huge pleasure. I just wanted to say that if there are people whose questions I haven't answered, obviously there are, please feel free to send me those questions, forward them to me. I will be more than happy to respond to them in writing, you know, or by other media. As you know, as the case may be. So please forward the questions to me that I'll be more than happy to answer them in good time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Davison?
Luciana, may I just ask for a big round of applause because it was a wonderful, magnificent lecture. Can I just see your faces, people? I'd love to. You should just turn on your cameras now. It's all allowed.
Excellent. Oh, it's nice to see you.
Wonderful.
It's
Thank
so
you.
Nice to see all of you.
Thank you, Rafael. It was amazing. Really, truly. I mean it. Great work.
Thank you for your kind words, Davison, as always.
So, guys, now Luciana will give some announcements.
Okay. After this great session we had, of course, this is just the beginning. And I have some things to say to you. First of all, it's such a pleasure to have you all here. And remind you to do your homework, which is specifically going on Twitter. And, you know, write your short essay there, talking about your, you know, main ideas on the topic that we discussed today, mentioning Professor Scopacasa's lecture. And you saw on the on our WhatsApp chat, on our WhatsApp group, we were asking for volunteers who were musicians, because on Saturday, on our final session, we will have a luau. A luau is a typical, I think, Hawaiian get together for singing and saying poetry and reciting poetry. But then Brazilians just, you know, took that and got that as our own cultural get together as well. So we do that a lot at the beaches, and even here in Belo, or we call Belo Horizonte Belo, okay? A lot, or BH sometimes. And then we don't have beaches here, but then, you know, we go everywhere and we have luau's, and we have lots of luau's at UFMG, for example. And then we're gonna have one, and we want to invite all the musicians, and even if you're not you know, an excellent musician, you're just an amateur musician, you can, you know, choose a song. It could be a song from your own country. You can have a playback if you don't play any instruments, and then you let us know because we're gonna write a list so as to organize the event next Saturday. Okay, not this Saturday, next Saturday, next week. Another important announcement is that tomorrow we're having a tour uh, to Nochi, which is, you know, an open air museum, one of the biggest in the world. They have great contemporary and modern art pieces. It's a wonderful place, and that you will surely want to come back to visit that. And we're gonna do that at 2 p.m. tomorrow. So it's just a reminder. And this one, that is also part of our cultural events, we are going to have a film discussion session, right? So it's what we're calling the movie club. And there's this very, very important, interesting, and very important movie that is called Que Horas Ela Volta. In a very bad translation I'm just about to make is at what time is she going to be back? Something like that. And then we got a special link to that film. You can watch it. The movie club is going to be on the 14th. Okay. And then I'm going to leave it here on the chat, the link. It's a private link, so only people with the link can watch it because we got a, you know, a special permit, you know, watch that video. And then this, yes, the translation, the title in English is The Second Mother, which I don't think translates very well, but the rest of the movie is gonna, you know, tell its own story. And oh, I sent the link wrongly to one person only. Oh, sorry. Okay, and then this is the link, but I'm also gonna leave it on our group in WhatsApp, and then you can watch it at any time you like. And then the discussion is gonna be on the 14th. But it would be interesting, it would be important for the debate if everybody could watch it before the 14th. And it got English subtitles, so, and it tells a lot about Brazil, and we'll have the opportunity to discuss about that on the 14th. And I guess that's it, right, Professor? I think we'll meet each other again at 8, and you will stay for the Portuguese class. That's going to be at 10:30.
Exactly. Thank you, guys.
And my special thanks to Professor Rafael, who, you know, kept the timing so precise.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for your attention. And don't forget to send me questions if you have them. I put my email address in the chat column, so feel free to send me an email, drop me a line, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. The correct address is the second one. I wrote 2, but the first one is
okay.
there's a typo. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you.